One thing that Oda has always been good at is how he protects his strong characters. Since the very beginning of One Piece, Oda has been very conscious and calculating in how he chooses to use stronger characters and where he chooses to use them within the story. We've seen many anime and manga in the past create a great power dynamic within their universe, but as time went on and some of the strongest characters were put into action early on, it almost always ends up damaging the power system as a whole within that story by the time we get to the endgame. So much so that now characters who were once seen both narratively and through actual feats as some of the very strongest in that universe are now seemingly old news and completely outshined by newer characters who have more involvement in the final stages of the series. But Oda took a more slow and methodical approach to this, that even now 1000 chapters in, the same names that we thought were the strongest characters 100 chapters in are the same people we see at the very top today. And this isn't simply because Oda withheld them from action. I would be lying if I said this wasn't the case with a lot, if not most of these characters, like with Dragon, Mihawk, the 5 Elder Stars. But many characters such as Blackbeard, Shanks, the Admirals, and Whitebeard have had plenty to show us on screen in terms of feats and how strong they really are from as early as Marineford. And even now, well over a decade later, they are all unanimously agreed upon by the fanbase to be men at the very pinnacle of power within the series. And this is because of how Oda manages to show them in action and show us what they are capable of, while at the same time managing to protect them and their overall image when it comes to their level of power. So what I'm gonna do today is discuss in detail how exactly Oda makes this possible. Where most other long-running shonen fail in keeping their stronger characters in the very beginning of the series to still appear at the pinnacle of strength by the end, Oda succeeds in this effortlessly. But I'm not going to talk about characters like Dragon, Mihawk, or the 5 Elder Stars, where all Oda has to do is refrain from showing us any fighting from them at all up until the endgame. But I'm gonna talk about those characters whom we've seen in action early on and still are some of the strongest characters we know of today. And the craziest part about this is that you will find with each of these characters that I'm about to mention, Oda protects them in completely different ways, each with a different writing approach on how he manages to do this. And I want to start by talking about none other than Shanks. But before we begin, we are so close to 3,000 subscribers, guys, so if you guys do enjoy these videos, please subscribe to the channel and like the video for more content just like this. Shanks is perhaps the best example of this, if for no other reason than because he was literally introduced in the very first chapter, immediately after Luffy's own introduction. And even though we don't know exactly how strong Shanks is by the end of chapter 1, what we do understand is that he is extremely strong. In reality, all chapter 1 showed us was that Shanks and his crew were significantly stronger than the 8 million berry bounty Higuma and his bandits. But as time went on, it wasn't long before we quickly saw just how small 8 million berries really was, and by extension, the feat of effortlessly defeating the bandits held no weight, as mostly any character in the Grand Line could achieve this same feat. Yet we still knew Shanks was extremely strong, even when this feat no longer felt the least bit impressive. Because Oda showed us Shanks' strength without letting us gauge even remotely of an idea of how much of his strength Shanks was actually using. Kind of like when Luffy knocked out 50,000 fishmen in Fishman Island. He was able to knock out half the army in a single Conqueror's Haki burst. And later on, Oda tells us that both Shanks and Rayleigh being in that same position would have knocked out all 100,000 fishmen with their own Haki. This tells us that Shanks and Rayleigh have significantly greater Conqueror's Haki than Luffy at the time, and just have really impressive Conqueror's Haki in general. But it also tells us this without actually revealing where their ceiling really is when it comes to their Conqueror's Haki. Oda simply stated that of the 100,000 fishmen present, they would be able to knock out all 100,000. This could mean anything, from maybe if there were 150,000 fishmen, Shanks and Rayleigh would only be able to knock out 120,000 as that's where their limit ends. Or perhaps if there was say 1,000,000 fishmen, Shanks and Rayleigh would also be able to knock out all 1,000,000 and still not reach their limit. It doesn't tell us where their limit actually is or let us gauge how strong they actually are, even in comparison to each other, because it's possible Shanks' ceiling was higher than Rayleigh's, or Rayleigh's was higher than Shanks'. But again, all we knew was both of them could at the very least deal with the 100,000 fishmen that were present on Fishman Island. And this is what chapter 1 did for Shanks in terms of his overall strength as well as his crews. We knew that the bare minimum was effortlessly dealing with the 8 million berry bounty captain and his crew, but we had no way of gauging Shanks' ceiling, which allows it to grow further and further higher up from what Oda may have initially planned. As the story progresses and Oda's power level system starts to expand to greater peaks, and slowly but surely we start to get a better picture of just how strong Shanks is, as well as unveil more about the world and power structure, with the reveal of Shanks being an emperor as well as the balance of power and how it works. And even with Shanks blocking Akainu's attack and stopping the war, he was able to do this without giving any hint of where his strength limit could really be. Let's imagine for a second if Shanks were to fight at Marineford. Let's say the Marines and the Blackbeard pirates did not listen to him and chose to keep fighting, and Shanks ended up fighting with someone like Blackbeard at the time. Narratively, it would be essential for Blackbeard to present some kind of challenge for Shanks, and even if it were just a quick clash, if we saw Shanks struggling in the slightest against a pre-timeskip Blackbeard, it would collapse everything that Oda has built around Shanks up until that point. People would be saying things like, well, Blackbeard showed some struggle against Ace in Banero Island, and Ace didn't even seem to have haki. Ace also drew with Smoker and Alabasta, etc, and so on. Even if it were a quick little scuffle between Shanks and Blackbeard at Marineford, by connecting all these little dots of clashes and fights we've seen here and there early on, it would have given us a solid idea of where Shanks' maximum limit of strength would be, to the point where him now facing up against a 3 billion berry bounty man with a Devil Fruit Awakening and who had just defeated Big Mom 2v1 and effortlessly one-shotting him and his vice captain without breaking a single sweat, it just wouldn't make sense. It would be inconsistent with what we've seen before. How could a man who struggled against a pirate, who struggled against Ace, who drew with Alabasta Smoker, now be one-shotting someone as strong as post-Wano Kid? And before you say that Blackbeard already scarred Shanks pre-timeskip, we have to take in the context behind that incident as well. And the context is that we simply don't have any context behind that. We don't know when this was, so this could be when Shanks himself was far weaker than he is now. We know Shanks wasn't being careless or reckless in the moment, but aside from that, we don't really know how Blackbeard managed to do it either. Shanks was able to scare off an East Blue Sea King with his haki, and later in that same chapter, Luffy could one-shot that very same creature at the literal start of his adventure. But now we see Shanks using that same haki to scare off a 3 billion berry bounty Navy Admiral from an island's distance, and now we're impressed with his Conqueror's haki yet again, the same one we saw in chapter 1. Shanks was able to defeat the 8 million berry bounty bandits without needing to basically do anything, and that impressed us. But then we see Luffy defeat 15, 17, and 20 million berry bounty pirates soon after, and Shanks no longer seems so impressive. But then we see Shanks one-shot a 3 billion berry bounty man and our jaws drop yet again, even though this was the same man who impressed us 1,000 chapters ago. In Shanks' case, Oda protects his strength by simply giving us the bare minimum we needed to see from him each time, while also not giving us any idea of what percentage of strength he was actually using in those instances, even up until today. Like negotiating a deal with a salesman without giving them your actual budget for the buy. Your budget may be 5,000, but your initial negotiating price is 2, or your budget could be 50,000 and your starting price is 1. No one knows what your actual limit is except you. Blackbeard's case is a lot different from Shanks's, because while Shanks's ceiling of strength is the same now as it was all the way back in chapter 1, Blackbeard's ceiling has grown as the story went on. Blackbeard wasn't always as strong as he is now. Just like Luffy, he grows stronger with every passing arc, and every time we revisit his character, he's stronger than he was the last time. Yet still, not only do we have no clue how strong Blackbeard is now, but we never had any real idea of how strong Blackbeard ever was. All we knew was that pre-timeskip Blackbeard was no match for the Yonko, and most likely the Admirals as well. As soon as Whitebeard figures out his ability, he casually almost kills him with just 2 hits. Blackbeard directly states that he's not yet ready for Shanks. He runs away at the mere sight of Akainu, not hesitating to give up on his ship and Bonnie as his capture. But aside from this, we never really knew how strong he was, and this is simply due to the fact that even to this day, we don't have a clear understanding of how Blackbeard's body works. I think everyone can agree that Blackbeard's main source for his strength is within his devil fruits, and his ability to obtain multiple fruits. And the main source behind Blackbeard being capable of eating multiple fruits is his body. So whatever the answer is to how Blackbeard can do this, the main source of his power and what the answers will revolve around is his body. And until we understand how exactly he's able to do this, so that we can get basic answers about his abilities, such as, is there a limit to how many fruits he can eat? And if there is, what is that limit? Where can he eat them? Are there any fruits he can't eat? Are there any drawbacks or side effects to him eating them? Does this affect his lifespan or quality of life? Until we get answers to these basic questions, how can we possibly determine where the ceiling for Blackbeard's strength could be? Because right now, nobody in the entire series is looking as limitless when it comes to their potential to keep getting stronger as Blackbeard is, not even Luffy. Up until Blackbeard, we were certain nobody could ever eat 2 devil fruits and survive. This was a guaranteed fact within the One Piece world. And now that Blackbeard has broken this truth, there's no reason for us to believe he's not capable of eating a 3rd, 4th, or even 5th fruit. Once the initial feeling of everything you thought you knew about something is broken, it's no longer going to feel as shocking to see it change again. For example, in our real world, we know that the sun rises from east to west every day, no matter where in the world you are. It's simply a given fact. But what if the sun were to rise from the west one day and you witness this with your own eyes? Would you then still think it's impossible for the sun to rise from the north or from the south on any given day? Or would you be more open to the idea of that happening now that your initial understanding of how the world works is shattered? This is the case with Blackbeard. Now that he's eaten 2 fruits already, there's no reason to believe he can't eat a 3rd. As a matter of fact, a lot of people have been theorizing for years that indeed he will eat a 3rd. But why stop there? If he can eat 3, then why not 4? If he can eat 4, then why not 5? This is how Oda is able to hold Blackbeard in a different light than everyone else. Much differently than Shanks, where in Shanks' case, Oda simply gave us the most we needed to know of what Shanks could do that would appear impressive to us at the time, like with the 100,000 fishmen example. But with Blackbeard, Oda could show us Blackbeard in real fights. He could show us Blackbeard struggling against Ace or losing against Whitebeard, and it wouldn't change anything, because as long as Oda concealed from us where the source of Blackbeard's power was coming from, he could always go back and draw more from the well that is the source of his power, and come back stronger time and time again. And if you guys are liking this video so far, I would ask that you guys please subscribe to the channel, as a whopping 95% of you who watch these videos aren't subscribed. So if you would like to see more videos just like this on a regular basis, hit that bell and subscribe to the channel. So like I said in the beginning, each character has a different approach in how Oda goes about protecting their image. We saw how he did this with Shanks by giving us the bare minimum we needed to see without giving us any idea of what percentage of power that was. And we saw how he did it with Blackbeard, being free to use Blackbeard however he wanted, so long as he could always draw more power from that well that we could never look inside of to see how deep the water goes. With the Admirals, however, I'll admit that this is probably the laziest style of approach Oda takes with any of the characters I'll discuss today. And it's been said so much within the One Piece community, it's practically become a running joke now. Let me ask you guys this. How many times have you been in a power scaling debate with a friend or fellow One Piece fan, and whenever Admiral slander comes up, the first rebuttal you hear is, well, the Admirals were holding back? I think almost every One Piece fan in the world has heard someone say that before. And while I'm not known for being the biggest Admiral fan myself, and usually argue against that statement, I will admit that there is some truth to it. It's just a question of how much. Personally, I don't see it as the Admirals holding back, but rather that they have something to lose. For example, in Marineford, Sengoku makes it abundantly clear that the fortress of Marineford itself can go down, and it would be an acceptable loss for the Marines, so long as the actual symbolism of them being a force at the center of the world and protecting the citizens from pirates remains. They could always rebuild a new Marineford, as they ended up doing, so long as it remained in the center of the world. And yet we see the sentimental value it holds to them when Akainu stops Whitebeard from destroying the island. The same thing goes with Greenbull and Fujitori's battle with the revolutionaries in the Holy Land of Marijoa. We know that the Celestial Dragons, the God's Knights, Imu, and the 5 elders all live in Marijoa. It's the most prestigious island in the eyes of the world government, with its epithet literally being the Holy Land. I don't necessarily think that Fujitora and Green Bull were holding back in this fight, because it would be insulting to do so against a strong enemy going all out to destroy the place that you hold most sacred. Holding back would not make the damages any less, because the Revolutionary Army already wanted to make a strong statement with their invasion and officially declare war against the world government. Their best bet would be to do whatever they can to remove the enemy as quickly as possible. But I do think that being fully aware that they have so much to lose in this battle could play as a distraction in their fights. They would have to be fighting the entire time while being aware that the longer the fight goes and the worse it gets, the bigger the consequences might be for them later on. It wouldn't stop them from going all out in my opinion, but it would be an additional thing on their mind that they don't need during a full-scale battle. Just like with every Navy soldier at Marineford, none of them were actively holding back, because even they suffered plenty of losses that would easily have been prevented if any of them were holding back their strength. But they were fighting against the Whitebeard pirates, fully aware that with every attack from either side, and with every passing minute the fight went on, the losses that the island would take would increase drastically. And so by holding on to this burden of a distraction, both at Marineford and at Marijoa, you could argue whether or not they were holding back the actual limit of their strength itself, but I think a better description of it would be that they were not as focused as they could have been. Their eyes weren't 100% on the prize. You could also make this same argument with Kuzan versus Garp at Hachinosu, however I think with a much less chance of it actually being true. All of this to say that now, if and when we finally do see an admiral go all out, with no distractions and a free mind to cause as much chaos as possible, perhaps we'll see a lot more from them than we ever have yet. And keep in mind, it's not just the fact that the admirals are extremely strong, but they are purely devil fruit based characters, accumulating some of the best and most destructive fruits in the world. So for them to freely be able to cause whatever damage may be necessary is much different than say a hockey user like Shanks or Rayleigh, or someone with a less destructive fruit like Law or Kid having those same circumstances on them. I'm not really going to get into the Luffy versus Kizaru situation on Egghead, because that one I think is a lot more complicated, and until Kizaru's role in that arc is concluded, I want to refrain from taking any strong stances on it just yet. If you were to ask me now, my honest answer would be that I don't think Kizaru was holding back. I think he was still going all out, just with a lot of distractions on his mind given the obvious context of that fight. And that would make this fall under the exact same circumstances as all of the other Admiral fights I already mentioned. But like I said, I would rather wait for the arc to play out before making an official stance on the Luffy versus Kizaru situation. So even though we've seen plenty of Admiral fights and clashes up until now, Akainu versus Whitebeard, Kuzan versus Garp, Luffy versus Kizaru, Fujitora and Green Bull versus the Revolutionaries, Green Bull versus the Scabbards, and Fujitora versus Sabo. It's still difficult for us to pinpoint just exactly how strong they really are. Not necessarily because they were holding back, but because they had more burdens on their minds than they needed to. And yet even though they were seen going all out relatively early on in the series, the Admirals don't suffer from any power creep and are still seen as some of the strongest fighters even today, despite all the new characters, powers, and abilities introduced since then. And lastly, let's bring Whitebeard to the center stage. There were so many factors that played into why we didn't get to see Whitebeard at his best that it's gonna be hard to focus all of it into a single category or reason. For one, there was his declining health, which was the main reason for Whitebeard's failure at Marineford. But there was also his old age, his own Nakama stabbing him in the back, the distractions of having Ace almost killed right in front of him multiple times, and having to prioritize allowing his crew to escape safely. All of these were major disturbances that Whitebeard had to deal with at Marineford. But what they all had in common at the end of the day is that they were all external factors that acted as a handicap to slow Whitebeard's strength and progress down during the Marineford War. And in some cases coming in split-second moments, whereby hindering Whitebeard for that single moment, it would shift the story drastically. One thing that Oda wanted to make perfectly and abundantly clear to every reader was that regardless of how Marineford went down, Whitebeard was obviously not at his best. And if he was, things would have gone a lot differently. This was the man that was introduced as the world's strongest man, even in his old age. He was already coming into the war old and sick, and this still wasn't enough to stop him. Before he could even step foot off his ship and enter the war, Oda had to further establish an additional handicap on top of his old age and poor health, just to level the playing field. By having Squard stab Whitebeard clean through the chest, Whitebeard can now fight the Admirals with an excuse if he didn't absolutely annihilate them. It took him being sick, having a sword through his chest, and being 72 years old. And it still took a sudden heart attack for someone as strong as Akainu to overpower him. This is absolutely insane when you compare it to any other character in the series. Oda protected Whitebeard more than anyone else, and it's not even close. Anytime Oda needed someone else to shine for the pirates at Marineford, he had to give Whitebeard some random handicap out of nowhere just to remove him from the picture. He had a random heart attack right before Ace was executed just so Luffy could use Conqueror's Haki. He had another random heart attack later on just before finishing off Akainu, and this allowed Akainu to deal a lethal blow before still going on to lose to Whitebeard in the end. And now with all of these injuries accumulated through distractions and unfair circumstances, he still manages to get the better of Blackbeard one-on-one until the whole gang pulls up on him and finally kills him. Akainu couldn't come back into the equation after his fight with Whitebeard until Whitebeard was dead. Otherwise the threat level wouldn't be there because Whitebeard would just come right back and beat Akainu again, no matter how badly injured he was. Shanks couldn't have the impact he did in stopping the war unless Whitebeard was dead and there was no sign of hope at all for the pirates, which in turn made Shanks that ultimate ray of light that saved the day, preventing the worst case scenario from happening. With Whitebeard gone, there was no one remotely strong enough to quote-unquote stop the bully until Shanks arrived, and that's what made this moment so impactful. And even after his death, a small fraction of Whitebeard's power remained in Blackbeard, and it proves to be nothing short of absolutely destructive and terrifying for the Marines. It's actually crazy how many twists and turns the plot of Marineford had to use just to get around the single character of Whitebeard. Figuring out how to make it so the Marines win and the Whitebeard pirates lose while having Whitebeard present proved to be one of the biggest challenges Oda has ever had to deal with when mixing power scaling with narrative writing and plot progression. Whitebeard lost going all out in a war halfway through the series before Haki was even a fully fleshed out concept, and since then the ceiling of strength has grown exponentially, making most characters from that time appear weak in comparison to some of the feats we are seeing today. Yet Whitebeard doesn't fall victim to this in the least bit. Despite not using Haki, despite no Devil Fruit awakening, and despite not being able to put down an Admiral as easily as some may have expected, the Whitebeard that we saw at Marineford, as old and as sick as he was, is still considered by most to be one of the strongest characters we have ever seen. So whether it was by showing us just a fraction of power needed in that moment without hinting at how much was still left in the tank with Shanks, or by concealing the source of power itself and therefore concealing the limit of potential that can be reached, as in the case with Blackbeard, or taking a more complicated route in terms of characters' attachments and conflictions like with the Admirals, or just flat out stacking handicap after handicap after handicap like we get with Whitebeard. By using these different strategies with each character, Oda manages to protect his strongest characters for hundreds and hundreds of chapters in a way that most oftenly other mangaka fall short in executing. And now over 1,000 chapters later, we're seeing them in action yet again, still leaving us just as impressed and amazed by their strength as we were back then. Thank you all for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, I can practically guarantee that you'll enjoy this Marineford analysis video even more. Link to the video will be in the description, and I'll see you guys over there.